There's a document you were never meant to see. It doesn't appear in history textbooks. It isn't discussed in economics classes, and it never shows up in documentaries funded by financial institutions. Yet once you know it exists, you start noticing something unsettling because suddenly the modern world stops making sense. The document wasn't a manifesto. It wasn't written for the public. It was an internal assessment, cold, professional, and brutally honest. It circulated quietly among elite financial operators in the mid-19th century, and its conclusion was simple. There existed a form of human organization that made banks unnecessary, not inefficient, not outdated, unnecessary. And systems that make banks unnecessary do not get reformed. They get erased. What this document identified wasn't a rival institution. It was entire societies that functioned without debt, without interest, and without dependence on financial intermediaries. Communities that fed themselves, housed themselves, educated themselves, built monumental infrastructure, all without borrowing a single coin, and that made them dangerous. Because control does not come from violence alone. It comes from dependency. And people who don't need money cannot be controlled by money. So a decision was made, quietly, systematically, legally, to dismantle those systems everywhere they existed. And what followed was one of the most successful historical erasures ever carried out. We call it progress. But the evidence tells a different story. Between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, something vanished almost overnight. Craft traditions that had existed for centuries disappeared in a single generation. Building quality collapsed. Skills that once took decades to master were replaced with assembly line repetition. And an entire way of organizing human life was declared illegal. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. Let's start with a problem modern economics cannot explain. There are buildings all across Europe that should not exist, not according to the rules we're taught. Cathedrals that took decades to complete, palaces built with obsessive precision, bridges, halls, domes, and city centers that required the coordination of thousands of skilled specialists. According to modern logic, these projects would require massive financing, loans, interest, investors, debt. Yet when historians dig into the archives, the financial records are missing, not destroyed, not damaged, simply absent. What does exist are meticulous logs, material inventories, worker rosters, construction timelines, daily progress reports. Everything is documented, except money. In city after city, archivists find the same thing. No wage ledgers, no payment receipts, no interest calculations, just a recurring phrase written in margins and footnotes. Provision made through collective obligation. That phrase changes everything, because it implies something modern society has forgotten how to do. Organize labor without buying it. The key to understanding this lies in institutions that history now dismisses as medieval relics, guilds, but not the cartoon version we're taught about. Not unions, not clubs, not trade associations. These were fully integrated economic systems. If you entered a guild, your survival was guaranteed. Housing, food, tools, training, medical care, education, old age security, all provided, not as charity, not as wages, but as a right earned through contribution. You didn't sell your labor, you offered it. And in return, the community ensured you lacked nothing. Apprentices weren't paid, masters weren't wealthy, journeymen didn't negotiate salaries. Instead, status replaced money, skill replaced currency, contribution replaced transaction. The better you became, the more responsibility you held. The more responsibility you held, the more provision you received. The more apprentices you trained, the more respected you became. And respect, not accumulation, was the highest form of wealth. Here's the part modern economists never address. These systems produced abundance, not scarcity. The idea that humans must compete for survival is not natural. It is engineered. Guild economies eliminated artificial scarcity by removing profit extraction entirely. No rent, no interest, no debt, which meant no leverage. And leverage is everything to financial power. So the system had to go, but it couldn't be destroyed openly. People don't willingly abandon security. So instead, laws were changed, quietly. Across Europe, new regulations appeared. All labor must be paid in official currency. All exchanges must be taxable. All economic activity must pass through recognized financial institutions. What had existed for centuries was suddenly redefined as criminal. Working for provision became illegal. Sharing resources became tax evasion. Collective ownership became monopoly abuse. Guilds were dragged into court. Their defense was simple. We have always lived this way. The response was final. That way is no longer permitted. Their assets were seized, their properties privatized, their records destroyed, and their members were forced into wage labor. This wasn't modernization, it was conversion, from contributor to debtor. Once provision disappeared, money became mandatory. Once money became mandatory, debt followed. And once debt entered the system, interest ensured it could never be escaped. This is the mechanism that replaced mastery with dependence. Before, a craftsman needed nothing from a bank. Afterward, he needed loans to survive. Rent, tools, food, emergencies. Each necessity turned into a revenue stream. And with it came control. The psychological shift was just as devastating. Under the old system, excellence mattered. Your name lived on in stone. Under the new system, effort only enriched someone else. Your labor became anonymous. Your craft became replaceable. Your pride became irrelevant. Quality collapsed because meaning vanished. And here's something rarely acknowledged. Productivity actually declined. More workers, more hours, more machines, less lasting output. Buildings became disposable, materials cheaper, skills diluted. We didn't gain efficiency, we lost permanence. History tells us this was inevitable, but history is written by the system that replaced it, because this wasn't limited to Europe. Everywhere humans organized around contribution rather than currency, the same pattern occurred. Indigenous gift economies, reciprocal obligation systems, ceremonial redistribution networks, all criminalized, all dismantled, all labeled primitive. Giving became illegal. Sharing became suspect. Abundance became dangerous. Because abundance undermines control. Even today, you can see remnants of these systems trying to re-emerge. Open source software, volunteer knowledge networks, collaborative creative commons, people contributing not for pay, but for purpose. And notice how aggressively these spaces are monetized, regulated, or absorbed the moment they succeed. The pattern never changed, only the language did. What we lost wasn't just an economic system, we lost a worldview. One where human value wasn't measured by income, where survival wasn't conditional, where debt didn't define existence, and the evidence is still standing. Every ancient cathedral, every stone hall, every structure built to last centuries instead of decades, they are monuments to a forgotten truth. Money is not the foundation of civilization. It is the tool used to control it. And once you understand that, you can never look at the modern world the same way again. Because the question stops being, is there an alternative? And becomes, why were we never allowed to remember it? Once you accept that this system existed, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why don't we talk about it? Not just casually forgotten, but actively missing. Because if something truly failed, it would be studied, analyzed, taught as a cautionary tale. Instead, guild economies were erased so thoroughly that even questioning their disappearance sounds fringe today. That doesn't happen by accident. I started looking not at what historians wrote, but at what they stopped writing about. After 1900, detailed records of non-monetary systems vanish almost entirely, not gradually, abruptly. Entire categories of documentation disappear from archives. Terminology changes, language shifts. Words like provision, obligation, commons, mastery quietly fade out, replaced by wages, productivity, efficiency, profit. The new language didn't just describe reality, it created it. Because once labor is defined as something you sell, you are no longer a participant in society. You are inventory. And inventory must be optimized, replaceable, disposable, cheap. That transformation didn't require violence, just paperwork. And once it was complete, something remarkable happened. People forgot they had ever lived differently, which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. The banking system didn't just take control of resources, it took control of imagination. We can no longer picture a society without money, not because it's impossible, but because remembering it threatens everything that exists now. That's why alternatives are always framed as naive, or dangerous, or unrealistic, even when they already work. Because the most powerful prison is one where the inmates believe there is no outside, but cracks still appear, sometimes in places no one expects. In the early 2000s, economists studying collaborative networks stumbled onto something strange. Projects with no salaries, no hierarchy, no financial incentive, yet outperforming billion-dollar corporations, open-source operating systems, encryption protocols, internet infrastructure built by volunteers. People working thousands of hours, not for money, but for reputation, mastery, and contribution. Sound familiar? The same dynamics appeared again and again. Status replaced pay, contribution replaced transaction, access replaced ownership, and predictably, attempts to monetize followed immediately. Licensing, paywalls, subscription layers, corporate capture, not because the systems failed, but because they succeeded without banks. And that cannot be allowed at scale. Even today, laws still enforce this reality. You can give your labor away, but the moment it becomes organized, it must be priced. You can share resources, but the moment it sustains life, it must be taxed. You can live collectively, but only if it doesn't threaten real estate markets. The old system didn't die. It was outlawed. And what replaced it wasn't better, just easier to control. Here's the final piece most people never connect. Debt isn't primarily an economic tool, it's a behavioral one. A person in debt is predictable, compliant, risk-averse. They cannot walk away, they cannot refuse, they cannot stop. Under guild systems, people could say no. That made them dangerous. Today, nearly everyone lives one missed payment away from collapse. That's not a flaw. It's the design. And once you see that, you begin to understand why history had to be rewritten, why the past was reframed as primitive, why mastery was replaced with credentials, why permanence was replaced with planned obsolescence. The system doesn't need you skilled. It needs you dependent. But the evidence never went away. It's still carved into stone, still standing over city squares, still refusing to collapse after centuries. Every time you pass an ancient structure built without debt, you're looking at proof. Proof that another world existed. Proof that humans organized successfully without money. Proof that control, not necessity, gave us the system we live under now. And that raises one final question. If this was possible before, why wouldn't it be possible again? Not by going backward, but by remembering forward. Because the most dangerous thing to a system built on debt is people who realize they don't actually need it. And that is why you are never supposed to hear this story, but now you have. And once something is remembered, it cannot be forgotten again. There's a reason this realization feels unsettling instead of empowering at first. Because once you see the mechanism, you start noticing it everywhere, not just in economics, in education, in architecture, in time itself. The old system produced craftsmen who spent decades mastering a single discipline. The new system produces workers trained just enough to be useful and no more. Why? Because mastery creates independence, and independence is uncontrollable. Under contribution-based systems, learning was slow on purpose. Skill took time. Knowledge was embodied. You didn't just know something, you became it. Today, speed is everything. Certifications instead of mastery, credentials instead of contribution, deadlines instead of depth. Because speed keeps people from asking the wrong questions. And the wrong question is always the same. Why am I doing this? In guild economies, the answer was obvious. You were building something that would outlive you. You were contributing to a living community. You were earning honor, not income. In the modern economy, the answer is intentionally vague. To survive, to pay bills, to stay competitive. None of those inspire excellence. They inspire compliance. And compliance is far more valuable than creativity. Look at modern cities, glass towers, disposable materials, identical layouts, built to maximize return, not longevity. Contrast that with ancient cities, stone, proportion, harmony, built to last, because no one was trying to extract profit from time. That's another forgotten truth. Debt requires urgency. Interest only works if time becomes an enemy. The faster things decay, the more often they must be rebuilt. The more often they're rebuilt, the more money flows. The more money flows, the more debt is required. Planned obsolescence isn't a business tactic. It's a financial necessity. Permanence is the enemy of interest. That's why the structures of the past feel almost alien to us now. They weren't designed to generate revenue. They were designed to remain. And remaining means resisting the logic of debt. There's something else the old system did that modern society avoids at all costs. It tied identity to contribution, not to consumption. Today you are defined by what you buy, what you wear, what you display. Under guild systems, identity came from what you could do, what you had mastered, what you had taught, what you had given. Consumption is endless. Contribution has limits, and limits threaten growth models. So contribution had to be reframed as inefficiency. You can see this shift even in language. We no longer say craftsman, we say worker. We no longer say calling, we say job. We no longer say provision, we say benefits. Everything became transactional because transactions can be monetized, meaning cannot. And here's the quietest, most effective part of the system. It makes you believe your exhaustion is personal failure, not structural design. If you're tired, it's because you didn't optimize enough. If you're broke, it's because you didn't hustle enough. If you're anxious, it's because you didn't plan enough. Under the old system, burnout was impossible because survival wasn't conditional. Today, fear is the fuel. Fear of falling behind. Fear of losing access. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Debt doesn't just extract money, it extracts attention. And a distracted population cannot remember alternatives, which brings us to the most dangerous idea of all. What if the system persists not because it's strong, but because we forgot how to live without it? History didn't end with the destruction of guilds. It was replaced with a story where money is natural, where debt is inevitable, where competition is human nature. But stories can be rewritten, and memory is contagious. The moment one person remembers, they start noticing inconsistencies. Why does abundance exist alongside manufactured scarcity? Why does productivity increase while security declines? Why does technology advance while quality degrades? These aren't accidents, they're symptoms of a system that optimized extraction over endurance. But here's the part they didn't anticipate. You cannot fully erase human instincts for contribution. They resurface in mutual aid networks, in volunteer communities, in moments of crisis when money temporarily stops mattering. Watch what happens after disasters. People share, people build, people contribute, not because they're paid, but because it's natural. Money only returns later to capture what already worked without it. That's the pattern. And once you recognize it, you realize something profound. The guild system wasn't destroyed because it belonged to the past. It was destroyed because it belonged to the future, a future where humans aren't leveraged against themselves, where skill matters more than accumulation, where security isn't conditional on obedience. That future was postponed, not eliminated, because systems based on contribution don't die. They go dormant, waiting to be remembered, and memory is powerful because the moment enough people remember, debt loses its grip, fear loses its leverage, and control becomes impossible. That's why the story matters. Not as nostalgia, not as fantasy, but as a reminder. The world you live in is not the only one that ever worked, and it's not the best one humans have ever built. It's just the most profitable, and profits only matter to those who control them. There's a moment that comes near the end of every forgotten civilization, not when it collapses, but when it's no longer remembered as an option. That's the moment power truly wins, because force can destroy structures, but forgetting destroys possibilities. The guild world wasn't just dismantled physically, it was dismantled psychologically. People were taught to associate security with money, identity with income, worth with productivity measured in currency. And once that association was complete, the old system no longer needed to be suppressed. It simply felt unthinkable. Ask someone today how they would live without money. They don't answer with ideas, they answer with fear. That fear is not natural, it was learned, because a society that cannot imagine alternatives will defend its cage instinctively, even when it's suffering inside it. This is why the story of contribution-based economies never ends with their success. It always ends with ridicule. They were inefficient. They were primitive. They couldn't scale. Yet the evidence contradicts every claim. They scaled across continents. They endured for centuries. They produced work that still stands when modern construction fails. What they couldn't do was generate endless profit for intermediaries, and that was unforgivable. The greatest illusion of the modern world is that complexity requires money. But complexity existed long before banks did. Cathedrals required logistics more intricate than modern office towers. Guilds coordinated thousands of people without digital systems. Provision networks distributed resources without prices. What money actually did was simplify control. It reduced human relationships to numbers, turned obligation into contracts, turned trust into enforcement, and once everything could be measured, everything could be owned. This is why education changed, not to teach mastery, but to produce standardized units of labor. This is why cities change, not to foster belonging, but to maximize throughput. This is why time changed, not to mark seasons and cycles, but to bill hours. Nothing about this was accidental. It was coherent, systematic, global, and incredibly successful. So successful that most people now believe this is how humanity has always lived. But belief is not truth. Stone remembers, wood remembers, iron remembers, the buildings remember. They are physical objections carved into reality. They say we were built without debt. We were built without profit. We were built to last. And they stand there quietly while we rush past them, paying interest on lives we never chose. Here's the final thing you need to understand. The system does not fear rebellion. It fears remembrance. Rebellion can be crushed. Movements can be infiltrated. Leaders can be bought. But memory spreads sideways. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't require authority. It doesn't ask to be monetized. Once people remember that survival does not require submission, the spell breaks, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, irreversibly. People start sharing instead of competing, teaching instead of hoarding, building for use instead of resale. The old logic begins to fail, and the system responds the only way it knows how. By calling it unrealistic, by calling it dangerous, by calling it impossible. It has always done that, because the most dangerous idea in history is not revolution. It's the idea that we already knew how to live and were taught to forget. So the next time you pass an ancient building, something made to outlast empires, don't just admire it, listen to it. Because it's telling you something. This world was not built on debt. It was rebuilt with it. And if it was built once without banks, it can be built again without them. The only thing required is remembering. This story doesn't end here. It continues every time someone notices something that doesn't quite fit the official explanation. So if this made you see the past or the present differently, leave a comment with the word remember. Not for me, for the next person who finds this and wonders if they're the only one questioning what we've been taught. And if you don't want to forget again, you know what to do.